Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Skybound Capital's podcast series, Under the Macroscope. As always, we welcome your feedback, we welcome your comments, we welcome your questions on the various topics that we address during the course of the podcasts, and generally bringing in members of the Skybound Capital Group to give their views on their particular areas of expertise. Now, it's wonderful to be able to welcome to the podcast today, all the way from Australia, Frank Zvonar, who is the CEO of the Leisurecom Group, which is immersed in the travel and tourism industry. And I don't think it takes too much to realize that travel, tourism, hospitality has been one of the industries most badly affected over the last 2 years by COVID-19. So it's going to be fascinating to get Frank's thoughts on how this has affected the industry, how the industry is building back globally. So Frank, great to have you on the podcast. And if I can start by asking, you've been in the travel and leisure sector for most of your career. As I've said in the intro there, COVID-19 has clearly been the biggest ever threat to the industry. So using your specific Australian experience, can you give us a sense of the annual value of the Australian travel and tourism industry and where it has returned to at this juncture as we come out of COVID?
Yes, great. Thanks, Matt. It's great to join you today and to see you again. It's certainly been an interesting ride the last few years in the travel industry globally, and of course in Australia we've certainly, unfortunately, ridden out a lot of painful times. The industry as a whole, 650,000 employees across the travel industry, and that's separate to the hospitality industry, effectively lost their jobs in the industry. Many of the travel companies in that time had to wind down and cease trading. Over the years, I've spent over 20 years working in the travel industry, and that regrettable incident of September 11, for example, and different periods of wars on terror, we always have seen interruptions and disruptions to the travel industry, but nothing the scale of what COVID brought. It's fair to say that the value declined, the revenue from flights, accommodation, the on-ground yield conversion into hospitality trade sector like restaurants, but also tourism, theme parks and attractions. The industry really fell over a cliff. To put it into quantums for you, Matt, it would be close to saying that pre-COVID, we had a $126 billion total travel and tourism industry with domestic product and international travel. At the end of 2021, it actually picked up from 2020 to $63 billion, so half of the value that the travel and tourism industry was rocking and soaring to incredible heights pre-COVID. So very difficult times. 2020, it actually dropped down to $56 billion. So the 60 odd billion dollars that we generated in the end of 2021 was an increase. The good news is, thanks to a range of reasons and vaccination levels and other restrictions being lifted, the outlook for 2020 is so much more positive, which is certainly great for so many small tourism operators, airlines, big and small boutique airlines. We're expecting a 21% increase growth this calendar year, which is fantastic news.
But Frank, as you build back, anecdotally, do you think people have maybe become more pessimistic about travel as a consequence of COVID, more likely to maybe narrow their horizons, or has being locked down, do you think, perhaps sparked enthusiasm as the restrictions lift?
Absolutely, I would say that the pessimism was there more in a fear of being caught out. In Australia, we've got 6 to 7 states and territories and regions with variant border closures from the state premiers. People started to plan their trip in their own backyard. They spent less number of nights. The duration of a holiday decreased. What it meant, though, is that they were more frequently traveling in their own backyard. They didn't need to cross borders. So that early pessimistic view was based on confusion, and then realizing that if they were going to beat the mundane, work-life syndrome, they could still experience freedom, but just do it close to home, so it wasn't too far to get back home should they need to cross a border in a hurry. The enthusiasm is absolutely there now. The intent to purchase has returned 2 years on. Internationally in Australia, if I can speak to Australia, Matt,
Yep.
Domestic travel is strong. It's returned, that pent-up demand. Internationally, it's still a reluctance there due to those variable jurisdictions and policies around what you need to show from a testing point of view, a vaccination point of view on arrival, be it that you're looking at Singapore or Fiji or New Zealand or Cape Town, for example. So there's still a little bit of a slow coming back to the international travel market at this stage.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a moment. That sort of potential confusion. But for now, I want to move to cruising, because I know that's part of your business as well. And if we think back just over 2 years ago, the name Diamond Princess was making headlines all over the world. The cruise ship that became infamous in the early stages of the pandemic as what one could describe as a poster child for a super spreader. How much of a hit has been taken by the cruise industry, and are there signs of recovery there?
Yeah, I guess there's no greater example of the death of tourism and the death of travel than the actual cruise sector itself, Matt. It literally died. It stopped for over 2.5 years. They've only announced in Australia since that super spreading event, the Diamond Princess, as you mentioned, in December 2019 or January 2020, when it all started. In Australia, it was even recognised as a contributor to the great spread itself. So for 2.5 years, domestically and internationally, no cruise vessels have touched the water. No passengers have boarded a cruise ship in Australia. And this month of April, that ban is being uplifted in literally just 2 weeks from now. So when we talk cruise, it's one of the most lucrative forms of travel you can have. Some people actually take money out of their superannuation account and they put it towards that cruising experience of a lifetime, often with groups, often with family or long friends from around the planet, and they converge on Honolulu or they converge in Canada and they hop on an amazing experience. And like most industries, emotions drive an experience trip, not the price sensitivity. And so we're talking about a sector that was so lucrative that literally fell off the edge of a cliff. But again, in April, that's about to change. And that pent-up demand that has been waiting. The biggest insight from the last 2 years is forced not to travel. People have had more time to plan that trip of a lifetime. And cruise customers, if anything, are resilient and they will always cruise. It was always the message from our research, cruise customers saying they're still going to cruise, they're just waiting for when they can. And what that means is the bookings that are coming in are at a higher booking value, or what we call a total transaction value, than any time prior. They really are putting their penny towards that experience that they've been deprived of, and it's starting to flow into the business.
That's a fascinating point you make around emotion, because I totally get that around cruising, but I suspect all the way through the travel sector that emotion does play a role, because it often involves seeing family or friends that you haven't seen for a long time, and there's a point at which price isn't immaterial, but it's less of a factor than the emotion. So that's a fascinating factor to take cognizance of. Just a reminder, we're talking to Frank Zvonar, the Chief Executive of Leisurecom Group in Australia, talking all things travel and tourism, the effects of COVID, and how the travel industry is building back both in Australia and globally. If you have questions that you'd like to answer or comments that you'd like to make, please do let us have them. The website address is going to be posted during the course of the podcast. There'll also be an email address on your screen. So please do get in touch and give us your questions and your queries. Frank, as we continue, you brought up a little earlier that the sort of different restrictions and regulations and how they're applied by different tourism operators, and this being a stumbling block to a potential full-scale return. Just as an example, I saw last week, some airlines have lifted masking requirements, others haven't. And that's, I think, dependent on the destination. Some places require negative tests before travel, others don't. Do you see the possibility of having a standardized travel industry again?
I do. I think that before it's standardized, it's some way off. But what I'm noticing anecdotally and from my peers in the travel industry, it's almost as if now, 2 years into this COVID journey, what the new normal looks like, where there was once consumers that were discouraged. We spoke earlier around confusion, reluctance. If anything, there was a bit of annoyance about the, scanning in for the QR codes, wearing the mask and sitting on a plane where you were previously spaced out 2 meters in a lineup to hop on the plane, and next minute, like sardines, you're sitting there with a mask on. And as you say, the variations between carriers within the aviation sector, it's not aligned. I believe without doubt it will become standardized, but right now I'm feeling more and more likely that it's assumed anyway that the new normal and the travel industry recovery has already begun as if it was standardized. It's certainly not as frustrating or confusing as it is. It is not stopping the intent to inquire, to travel, and now finally to make a booking, despite those variations that are there. And it's not just the travel or tourism operators where there's that variance between the flow and customer journey between the operators, but even as we said earlier, on ground, when you arrive in a city from New York to Sydney, those differences about the knowledge you need to acquire between going to the movie theatre or the cinema or the restaurant. Will you need to show your digital tick, your full vaccinations digital certificate, or will you need to scan? Even here on the Gold Coast, where I know you visited recently, you can go to one restaurant and walk straight in. Another restaurant, whilst not having a mask, will require you to fill out the scan the code and show your certificate. The main thing is it's not stopping consumers traveling, eating out in Australia, and I imagine in most societies. And I do believe that standardisation will happen at a faster rate now, because the policies and the protocols and the policy setters have got a strong level of example between their peers. If one airline's having a mask policy and one's not, I believe that it would very quickly align to the standardised airline policy very soon.
Which leads seamlessly to a sort of double-edged question. I mean, you've mentioned some of the trends you're seeing in Australia right now, and you also mentioned right up front the value of the tourism industry and how that was decimated in COVID. So just if you could comment on the trends you're seeing in Australia right now in terms of travel, both domestic and international, how important those trends are for Australian GDP. And then just added to that as a second part of the question, I mean, in your opinion, and I know this is Frank's opinion, do you think some places will regret having hard closed borders for such long periods and restricted movement of people, given that the virus has spread regardless, notwithstanding the fact that it's been a much milder version than what we first experienced?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Matt. I'll certainly give my opinion on that second part of that question. I guess the first question, and the economy of Australia, the GDP, as we've already mentioned, it took a hit. The economy of Australia took a hit. The travel industry was a huge part of the economy and the GDP, and then the hospitality sector. Right now, as I mentioned, we're around $50-60 billion. We were at $126 billion just before COVID struck. The key insights, not only is the travel industry recovery happening as we speak, it's fascinating. We talk about emotions earlier, Matt, but it's fascinating human behaviour, where we were all working in Australia. On the east coast of Australia, there were lockdowns for 3 months in Sydney and Melbourne, most of Australia's population. And so they were forced to stay at home and still work. And so you're living in your abode working, and you were not able to even walk outside the house to walk the dog or stretch your legs for more than 1 hour. And so what that's created, we say the words pent-up demand, but what it's really created as creatures of habit is this absolute wild, insatiable need to go travel, but experience the opposite of concrete jungles. And so there's a huge trend, as I mentioned, to even during COVID, to holiday in your state or territory close to home, but the emergence of something completely different to the city or the concrete jungle that you live in. People going into outback and people renovating these big sort of sea containers and putting them on the market through Airbnb for an experiential traveling experience, unlike anything people were used to doing. Right now, health and wellness travel as a customer segment, even before COVID, health and wellness as a customer segment was on the rise. You can only imagine now how many travel retailers across Australia are curating holiday experiences and itineraries based on what people have suffered for 2 years. When you talk about, which I'll go into my opinion next, the true cost of these draconian measures, if I call them that, the need to reset your compass map, be it in the Gold Coast, be it Fiji or Bali, to go by yourself or with another traveller and do it together and come back reinvigorated, rejuvenated. That is absolutely what the data is telling us, that Australians and I expect in the West, the rest of the world, there's a huge drive towards resetting that compass physically and mentally to get back into the grind, because it's been if I can say it, a hell of a time. Not just health and wellness, but cultural experiences. Again, instead of, now that the travel industry is recovered, instead of going to Auckland, people might go south of the Southern Island and do an immersive ritual cultural experience more than they might have considered before. To again, get out of the concrete jungle mode as well for something completely different. Typically in travel, people gravitate to those relevant experiences and then a sense of discovery, sense of something new. A mix of relevant and varied is what we're certainly seeing here. With the question you asked there, Matt, about those countries and those governments that particularly had a strong, heavy response to COVID, preventing movement, lockdowns, other countries such as our friends, the clever people in Sweden versus here in Australia, New Zealand. We spent 2 years in lockdown. We had border closures. I feel like I watched Northern America and the Europeans go to soccer stadiums. It looked like everyone was on the Algarve coastline of, I think, Portugal, or having a hell of a time. Yeah, we were unable to. The really important thing to do when putting an opinion forward, I personally think it looks like it was a waste of time, Matt. I won't lie. 2 years on, the spread of COVID is greater than it's ever been. And yet we've lifted all restrictions. We're free to come and go. Masks are off. Not every restaurant is getting you to sign in or check in. But of course, it's easy to have that feeling because it was such a painful time. But the reason we are able to roam freely now is because the minimum threshold for vaccinations was reached. And it's very difficult to judge the policy setters and the decision makers in the absence of a vaccine. And it took forever for the vaccines to come out. And so I think the true analysis and the true answer will come out in years ahead, where they holistically look at the cost beyond just the travel industry and the hospitality industry. They look at unemployment, they look at divorce, they look at other health, concerning health issues, hospitalizations from stress, suicide, all of those things, and the level of debt as well. It's a very tough one to say, but it certainly does feel to me like we've waited 2 years and we're still stepping into the dark and copping it on the chin as if we always were going to anyway.
Well, if I go back to the first part of your answer, I suppose what must be really exciting being in the industry, notwithstanding all the challenges and the stresses that you've had to endure, is that people, by the sound of it, are expanding their horizons. They're looking for new experiences, and the challenge for the industry will be to go and uncover some of those experiences and to package them together, to market them and to stimulate and encourage travel. So we wish you well on that journey. Right at the start, you mentioned, Frank, that the prognosis for the remainder of 2022 was a good one. So perhaps we can just finish off this fascinating chat by just saying your personal experience of expressions of interest and confirmed bookings. The prognosis for the rest of 2022 and into 2023 looking pretty good?
Unbelievably good, Matt. Each of the first 3 months of this quarter, January, February, March, this third quarter of the financial year or first quarter of the calendar, 50 to 100% growth month to month in the first 3 months, be that for the cruise sector and our recreational leisure sector. That pent-up demand is well and truly showing itself. And in some instances, there's limitations on available product on the supply side. So should that continue, it's going to be a stellar bumper 2022 year for all the industry, the category, and ourselves as well. So it's certainly promising times.
Well, that is great news, and as I said before, we wish you well on on that journey. We know you've had enormous challenges, but it's been fascinating to get your insights. And I tell you what, I really look forward to you being able to get to Cape Town. I was able to get over to Australia in September last year, and I'm heading there, I think in August again this year. So there's nothing like a face-to-face meeting. And whether that's family, friends, business, that's what travel is all about. So here's to the next face-to-face.
I would love that, to see you again and the whole team there at Skybound in Cape Town. I've never been to Cape Town, and to welcome anyone who comes to our shores in Australia as well would be fantastic, because that's what we have in common is family and also friends. So a real pleasure joining you today, Matt. I appreciate you having me on the show.
Oh, well, thanks very much. Frank Zvonar, the Chief Executive of Leisurecom Group in Australia, talking all things travel and tourism and the recovery post-COVID of this very, very important industry for any country. It cannot be denied that tourism is in many countries the bedrock of GDP. So we really wish you well in your endeavors. South Africa as well, we desperately need tourism to return in a big way. Fascinating to hear the thoughts from Frank. If you have any questions or queries about some of the issues and points that we've discussed on today's podcast, do get in touch with us. Skyboundcapital.com is our website, and there'll also be during the course of the podcast, as you've seen, methods to get in touch with us and give us your questions, your queries, and your feedback. Are there any topics that you'd like to see discussed on Under the Macroscope? You can download the Under the Macroscope podcast series on Apple, Spotify, and the Google podcast platform for Android, and all past editions of the podcast are available at our website, which is www.skyboundcapital.com. We hope that you will be traveling again soon, and that borders continue to open up and restrictions continue to lift. Until next time on Under the Macroscope, have a great week, everyone.